Now, as always, I like to say things and emphasize on certain things which are important. If you're going to have a product, do you judge the product based on how much of the product you're getting for a certain price? Or do you judge the product on the quality of the product that you're getting? That's the question that you must weigh all the time when you're thinking about something you're going to purchase. You don't only think about the quality and forget about the price. You also think about the quantity. How much of this thing I can get for a certain price. But you do also bear in mind quality. When you're evaluating boxers in boxing, it's this very same thing. You have to evaluate not only quantity, but also you must look at the quality of opposition. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about, but I'm going to mainly pay attention to quality. Why does quality supersede quantity? Quality supersedes quantity because quality or level of opposition is very important when we're talking about someone's career. For instance, Oscar De La Hoya. Oscar De La Hoya had 45 fights, but of those 45 fights, he lost 6. Ricardo Lopez, on the other hand, had 52 fights, and he drew 1. Now, if we're talking quantity, it looks like Ricardo Lopez, based on numbers, is a better fighter than Oscar De La Hoya. Because bang for your buck, at least in terms of quantity, it looks like Ricardo Lopez was a guy that won a lot of his fights and was very dominant as well. 73% knockout ratio versus Oscar De La Hoya, who had 45 fights and a 67% knockout ratio. Now, if you just go by those things alone, then obviously you can say that Ricardo Lopez had a much better record than Oscar De La Hoya. But now when we examine Oscar De La Hoya's level of opposition he's faced in his career, and we compare that to Ricardo Lopez's level of opposition he's faced in his career, Ricardo Lopez can't raise a candle to Oscar De La Hoya. Ricardo Lopez has no one on his resume that's a Julio Cesar Chavez. No one on his resume that's a Hector Camacho. No one. The closest thing he has to that would be the legendary fighter here, Anucha Fothong. Alright? And the only reason Anucha Fothong is anything like those guys is because he was able to win the minimum weight title a numerous amounts of times. Alright? He was a long reigning minimum weight champion. He's not in the bracket of Hector Camacho. He's not legendary like that. He's not in the bracket of Julio Cesar Chavez. He's not a multiple division title holder either. Now, there are a number of champions there that Ricardo Lopez did face, don't get me wrong, but nothing on the level of Oscar De La Hoya. Oscar De La Hoya beat Pernell Whitaker. There is nobody on the level of a Pernell Whitaker in Ricardo Lopez's resume. So you can't just look at quantity. You must look also at quality. Quantity is cool, but you must also look at quality. Now, we're only going to be looking at level of opposition. A lot of throwback fighters, a lot of people who are old school in their thinking, historians, etc., would tell you that Oscar De La Hoya is not an all-time great. He's not an ATG. They will tell you he's a Hall of Famer, but he's not an all-time great. They'll tell you, however, that Julio Cesar Chavez is the most legendary Mexican fighter. By the way, Oscar, Ricardo, and Julio are all Mexican fighters. Now, what's very interesting is when we look at Julio Cesar Chavez's resume, only the opponents he's faced. We're not talking about the opponents he's beaten. No, that's different. We're just talking about the opponents he's faced and the level of opposition Oscar De La Hoya has faced. We're going to look at both of them, and we're going to see who has faced top level opposition and even legendary opposition, if you want to go there, when we compare their resumes. We're not going to look at if they beat them. We're just looking at level of opposition. All right? Old school people would say Julio Cesar Chavez was a legendary fighter because he had 115 fights. And he went 87 and 0 without a draw. And then he went 89 and 0. 90 fights with one draw without losing. And they would say, Oscar De La Hoya, he's no Hall of Famer. He's no all-time great. He's not. Oscar De La Hoya is a joke. He got beaten by Shane Mosley. He got beaten by Felix Trinidad. And they would go on and on and on. Now, I'm going to show you very simply that Oscar De La Hoya is an all-time great. And whether you like it or not, that's just the reality of the situation. And also, we're going to compare his resume to Julio Cesar Chavez's resume. Okay? So let's go. We're going to look at all the legendary fighters that Julio Cesar Chavez faced. Or even good fighters. Even good fighters. We're going to use good and legendary. Alright? We'll go with good and legendary. So let's begin. The first good fighter he faced here is Roger Mayweather. And Roger Mayweather, even though he beat him here at super featherweight, went on to become a super featherweight champion, and he also went on to become a lightweight champion. Okay, so he was a good fighter. All right, I wouldn't call him legendary, even though some people would attribute that to him, but I would call him a good fighter. Okay, that's one. The next good fighter he faced was Rocky Lockridge, in a fight in which you can argue that Rocky Lockridge beat him. That's the second good fighter. Okay, and Rocky Lockridge would go on to become a champion himself. Now, Juan Laporte was also a former world champion, and so you must call him also a good fighter. Now, notice I haven't mentioned any of these guys. I haven't used the word loosely, legendary, for these names, even though some people will say they are legendary, and I would be forced to say I agree or disagree. But one thing I will tell you is Roger Mayweather is a legendary trainer, okay? But Juan Laporte was a champion. He was a good fighter. He wasn't in the category of Rocky Lockridge. Rocky Lockridge was a much better fighter than him, and also even Roger Mayweather. But the point is, that's three. Let's keep it moving. Edwin Rosario. Edwin Rosario was also a very good fighter. Very good fighter. In fact, Rocky Lockridge, Edwin Rosario, and Roger Mayweather were very good fighters. Juan Laporte was a good fighter. Jose Luis Ramirez was a legendary fighter. Legendary fighter. Now, I may say, well, he probably wasn't, but he was. Okay, so that makes it number 4 or number 5. Where am I at? Let's see. Roger Mayweather, Rocky Lockridge, Juan Laporte, Edwin Rosario, and Jose Luis Ramirez. That is 5. Sammy Fuentes was a world champion at a low weight class. And so Sammy Fuentes is also another one. That's 6. Meldrick Taylor is 7. Lonnie Smith was a world champion, so that's 8. Frankie Mitchell was a world champion, that's 9. Hector Camacho is a legend, that's 10. Greg Haugen was a long-standing world champion, that's 11. Pernell Whitaker is a legend, that's 12. Tony the Tiger Lopez was a great champion, that's 13. Oscar De La Hoya is a legend. That's 14. Joey Camacho was a world champion. That's 15. Miguel Angel Gonzalez. Now, he was a good fighter. I don't know if he ever became world champion. It's very possible he was. That's 16. Costa Zoo, legendary champion. That's 17. Okay? So, 17 fantastic names Julio Cesar Chavez has, and a couple legends in there, and all-time greats, right? Let's look at Oscar De La Hoya. See, De La Hoya was matched hard from the beginning of his career, okay? In his 12th fight, he was fighting for a championship, okay? Julio Cesar Chavez was doing it in his 40-something fight, okay? Old school versus new school, right? You start off harder in new school because you have Olympic pedigree. Jimmy Bredhow was a good fighter. He was the super featherweight champion at the time, undefeated. Or was he? Was he? Yes, he was. So, that's one. Jorge Paez was once a world champion. I wouldn't consider him a good, or he's a fair fighter. It's really up to you if you want to call him or not. And by the way, Oscar didn't stay at super featherweight for very long, okay? But nonetheless, Jorge Paez, you can count him or you don't. I'm going to opt not to count him. John Molina was a very good champion. Actually beat Azuma Nelson, I think, once. So that's 2. Gennaro Hernandez was a legend. That's 3. Jesse James Leija was a world champion. That's 4. He also beat Azuma Nelson twice. Julio Cesar Chavez, we just mentioned him. He's a legend. That's, what was that, 5? 5? Yes, 5. Miguel Angel Gonzalez. You just mentioned Miguel Angel Gonzalez. Did we? No, we didn't. Pernell Whitaker, that's 6. Hector Camacho, that's 7. Ike Corte was a world champion, a good fighter. That's 8. Felix Trinidad is 9. Shane Mosley is 10. Arturo Gatti is 11. Javier Castillejo is 12. Fernando Vargas is 13. Luis Ramon Campos is 14. These are all former world champions. Felix Stern, that's 15. Bernard Hopkins, that's 16. Ricardo Mayorga, that's 17. Floyd Mayweather, that's 18. And Manny Pacquiao, that's 19. Steve Forbes also was a former world champion. That's 20. 20 high caliber opponents. Now, Julio Cesar Chavez in his career, had a number of legends himself, probably more than Oscar. But when it comes to number of fights, remember, Oscar De La Hoya did this in 45 fights. Faced 20 good, very good, and legendary fighters. Julio Cesar Chavez faced 17 good, very good, and legendary fighters. 17. So Julio Cesar Chavez took 115 fights to face 17 legendary fighters. Oscar De La Hoya took 45 fights. Listen to me carefully. 45 fights to face 20 good, very good, and legendary fighters. That's why when I talk about quality versus quantity, Oscar De La Hoya, no doubt, is an all-time great, whether you like to say it or not, because he faced all-time greats. He faced Hector Camacho, he faced Pernell Whitaker, he faced Julio Cesar Chavez, he faced Floyd Mayweather, he faced Manny Pacquiao. He faced, well, Shane Mosley's not an all-time great. But my point anyway is, he faced Bernard Hopkins, who is going to be an all-time great for his longevity. Okay? He's also faced another all-time great in Felix Trinidad. This guy's, he's just littered with facing all-time greats. Okay? My point anyway is this. Oscar De La Hoya faced everybody. Well, almost everybody. He didn't face Winky Wright, but who's really complaining? I mean, Julio Cesar Chavez avoided certain people too. The point anyway is, Oscar De La Hoya, at the end of the day, actually, to me, has more legendary fighters on his resume that he fought than Julio Cesar Chavez. The difference is Julio Cesar Chavez got more victories over his opponents. But in terms of Oscar De La Hoya facing legendary all-time greats in his short career, we're talking only 45 fights now, folks. Okay? Only 45 fights he's done that. That in itself makes him an all-time great. And any old school person telling me he's not, you gotta give me a good reason. Because he beat all-time greats. He beat his fair share of all-time greats. Pernell Whitaker, Hector Camacho, and Julio Cesar Chavez twice. Okay? Okay, so some of the other all-time greats, contemporaries of his time, he didn't beat them. But you can't be telling me that Joe Frazier is an all-time great. Because the only all-time great he ever beat was Muhammad Ali. But Oscar De La Hoya is not an all-time great. And he beats Julio Cesar Chavez twice, Hector Camacho once, and he beats Pernell Whitaker, whether you believe Pernell Whitaker won or not. And there's an argument for Oscar beating Pernell Whitaker because he was landing the straight right on him. Yeah, Pernell dropped him. That's true. But you gotta look at it and say, well, Oscar was landing some shots too. He was looking stupid at certain points in time against Pernell, but he was landing the shots. So you can argue that fight was close enough to say, okay, he beat Pernell. It's debatable. It's debatable. Okay, I thought Pernell won, but that's me talking here. But you can look at it outside of yourself as a fan of a certain style and say, you know what, Oscar could have gotten the benefit of the doubt in this fight. It was close enough for that to happen. So, once again, Oscar De La Hoya, all right, has beaten 20 good, very good, and legendary fighters. Julio Cesar Chavez has beaten 17 good, very good, legendary fighters. If I had to say who had the better resume in terms of opposition, that goes to Oscar De La Hoya, hands down. Now, if I'm talking about resume in terms of wins against opposition, etc., then that goes to Julio Cesar Chavez. But barely, because Oscar did his stuff, everything he needed to do in 45 fights. In other words, Oscar had it tougher than Julio Cesar Chavez. From the beginning of his career, he had it rough. Let me show you what Oscar came in. The very first fight Oscar was put up against, the opponent was a guy with 1 loss, 1 draw, and he had already had 7 fights under his belt. Lamar Williams. Okay? And I don't know how Lamar Williams' career evolved after Oscar beat his ass, but let's just have a look. Okay, so his career didn't really do that well. Okay, it flopped. After Oscar whooped his ass, kind of went downhill from there. But the point anyway is that Oscar was put in hard. He's put in a journeyman in his second fight. A guy with 19 fights he was put in against. Then he was put in with a guy with 23 fights. And if that's not enough, he was then put in with a guy with 22 fights next. Okay? Then he was put in with Jeff Mayweather, who was a former, I think at the time, either before or after, Jeff Mayweather went on to win one of those partial world titles. Not a world title, but it's a partial world title. Okay? I think it's an IBO. Jeff Mayweather was a decent fighter. So what I'm saying to you guys, and he stopped him, by the way, in an 8th rounder. He stopped Jeff Mayweather. So, and Jeff Mayweather, look at how many fights he had. 27 fights. This is what Oscar began with. You don't even want to know what Julio Cesar Chavez began with. He was not match tough at all. Alright? This dude went up against debutantes all the way up to his to his 41st fight. He was still fighting debutantes. He was fighting journeymen too, but he did not begin nothing like Oscar. Nothing like him. Alright? He'd have a legendary career, don't get me wrong. He beat a lot of really good fighters and even legendary fighters he beat. But at the end of the day, Oscar did even better than him against some of those legendary fighters. Take, for instance, Pernell Whitaker. Julio says we know Pernell Whitaker was robbed. Okay? But he still got a draw against Pernell Whitaker. Oscar beat Pernell Whitaker. And it's more debatable than Julio Cesar Chavez. It was a one-sided fight against Julio Cesar Chavez. But against Oscar De La Hoya, you can't say it was a one-sided fight. You know what I mean? Pernell did make him look stupid at times. But Oscar was landing his straight right on Pernell Whitaker. Alright? So, You know, it was close enough for someone who is partial towards Oscar to give him the fight. So that's what happened there. But there's no excuse for why Perno lost to Julio Cesar Chavez. There's no excuse whatsoever. Okay. And then Oscar was the up and coming promising fighter there. So you know what it is. It is what it is. But anyway, my point is, when you look at Oscar De La Hoya's career, he was matched tough from the get-go. And I mean, even he fought an undefeated fighter to take the super featherweight title from him. A guy that had 16 fights. He didn't even have 16 fights at the time. Okay, so I'm just saying that when you look at Oscar 12 fights in. Floyd had his fight, I think 18 fights in. Oscar had 12 fights in, folks. And Oscar was undefeated for 31 fights. And this dude was matched tough every single time. And he passed every single test. Whether you say he it was a robbery or whatever, which it wasn't. The judges, he found a way to win and get the judges to put the decision into his hands. He beat John Molina. That was a world champion. And that dude beat Azuma Nelson. He beat Gennaro Hernandez. Okay, Gennaro Hernandez moved up in weight to fight him. But the point is, anyway, that he beat the legendary Gennaro Hernandez, who had not lost until he faced Oscar. And will go on to retain the super featherweight title, beat Azuma Nelson after that. Jesse James Leao beat Azuma Nelson twice. He had only had one loss on his record. Oscar retired that dude. Okay? You know what I mean? Then he goes on to beat Julio Cesar Chavez not once, but twice. He gets the decision over Pernell Whitaker. Alright? Those margins I see here are just ridiculous. There's no way he had that kind of margin over Pernell Whitaker by these judges. I don't know what they were seeing. But nonetheless, the point is, he got the nod over Pernell Whitaker. Hector Camacho, he beat Hector Camacho bad, man. He beat him bad. You know what I'm saying? Chavez tried to come back. He retired Chavez. You know what I'm saying? Alright, so I'm just saying. And then we didn't even talk about Obakar. Obakar was a pretty good boxer. He was no world champion or anything. Anyway, that's what I got to say about that. So always, when people start talking about, oh, this old school fighter, he had 200 fights. Or this old school fighter had 300 fights. Or this old school fighter had 100 and something fights. Just tell them this. Yeah, I understand your quantity. And that's cool. But we also got to look at quality. As Roger Mayweather would say, who the he beat and who the he fought. You know, I'm just editing it out. You know what I'm saying? That's what really counts at the end of the day. You guys have a great one.